next spring. Today we have Dr. Baltensperger, who's head of the Soil and Crop Science Department, and he's going to talk to us today about his trip to Turkey.
Okay.
That's what he said.
Hey,
Top turkey.
it's great to be here. You know, part of what I wanted to talk about is that my trip to Turkey was to go to the International Plant Breeding Congress, and I had the opportunity to be the keynote speaker there and talk about the future of plant breeding, which means that I talked about you, because you are the future of plant breeding in my mind, and it is where we're going. But while I was there, I had a lot of individual opportunities to talk about plant breeding and give you just a little background on the Congress. I think there were about 1,000 participants in the Plant Breeding Congress. I'd say that because Turkey was the host country this year, that they probably had the largest proportion and maybe approached a third of the participants. And then other countries, I think, and when I went down the list of participations, you know, it was kind of interesting because my geography wasn't good. Afghanistan, Algeria, Armenia, Australia, Azerbaijan, Brazil, Belgium, Bangladesh, Bulgaria, Cameroon, Canada, Egypt, Ethiopia, France, Georgia. I mean, you get the idea that I don't have to go through them all, that there were a lot of countries represented. The way they had it set up, there were 4 simultaneous translations to different languages. And so they had a little booth in the back, and your audience was all wearing headsets because they were listening to you through a translator that was giving your talk simultaneously. They didn't realize how cynical I was, or how many questions I asked, and so it was probably a rough translation, but fortunately I had every word on the slide. Yes.
I'm not sure if they can hear it.
Yeah, they can. They're on. They can hear me. Nod if you can hear me. At Dallas.
No.
Yes, we can. Yep.
Okay. And so it was a broad group. You knew, this is a diverse group, but the English language skills in here are really proficient. The group there was even more diverse, and very few of them spoke English. Almost all of them could understand and read English. And so they probably spoke English, they just didn't speak Texan. And so, you know, I always use the example of they wanted to know what the antelope ate. And I'm always a little confused by that because I call them antelope. And, you know, it's those kinds of things that even though you know the same language, you don't know the same language. And so we had a lot of issues in conversing. But it was a fun trip for me, a really fun trip. And what made it fun were about 4 things. And one was that every conversation I had, almost every conversation I had, brought up a plant breeder from Texas. So whether it was somebody working on peaches, or whether it was somebody that was working on peanuts, or whether it was somebody that was working on sugar cane, or whether it was somebody that was working on wheat, they mentioned a breeder from Texas that we had, or that they had interaction with. And that made it that made it really interesting. Now, I don't want to give you my whole talk, but I think Judy brought up some of my slides, so.
I'm trying, but it's not working. Anyway. I don't know.
Thank you. So, what I wanted to talk a little bit about today and share with you was just some of the talk, and so I'll go through it kind of fast. But I'm just going to use this. Starts with that transformational change has occurred in our food and fiber production system. The crop unit yields per unit of land have increased dramatically over the last 50 to 100 years. And you can look at it a lot of different ways, but the graph that I stole from BB is based on corn yields and shows some of the key events that have impacted corn. And, you know, we don't have many soil scientists that stepped in here today, but they think that they've impacted how yields have gone up. But even though they may have, most of it has been in combination because we've developed varieties that are responsive to that increased management. And so it's a partnership. It's not just one thing, but without breeding, we don't see the same kinds of yields. So what have been those drivers of change? And these are not in any particular order, but statistical approaches to plant breeding. I don't want to pick on anybody, but when I first did mean square errors, it was with a calculator that you had to pull a lever on to get the sums of squares, and we really knew what sums of squares were because we squared every darn number. And so today those error terms are just magical. They occur on huge data sets over multiple locations without uniform reps and everything else, and they're just there for us. And so statistical approaches to plant breeding have been a phenomenal improvement. Technology to produce hybrids of crops. You know, we still lag in the crops that we don't have hybrids in versus those that we do. There may be other reasons, but we lag in those crops where we have limited hybrid production. Elucidation of DNA form and function, and that way I got away with everything that is molecular and all of our understanding of it. But development of plant transformation systems, no. We take for granted today that we can transform most plants. In the 60s, we couldn't. And that's just 50 years ago that we didn't have that capacity at all. And every now and then, Dr. Brathor tells me how hard transformation is still. But we still operate, when we're talking about plant breeding, under the assumption that it can be done today. Development of high throughput sequencing, and that's a good one because everybody's got a different definition of high throughput sequencing depending on whether they got a brand new machine or they're ordering machine, or it's the one that they're going to order when they get the next $500,000. But the automation of sequencing is phenomenal. The development of markers, management of large data sets. While I was in Turkey, my 106-year-old aunt passed away, which gave me a little perspective on this time frame that we're talking about of 100 years of plant breeding. In that when she was born is the year that the Wright brothers tried to make a hop with an airplane and went about the length of this room in the air. She saw the telephone come into existence. She saw the automobiles really take off. She saw, and about a month ago we did FaceTime with her to show her some of her grand nieces and nephews. And those were things that her comic books were about in the 40s, where that you're actually going to be able to see each other. So the technology that we have to work with today is kind of phenomenal, but one of those is the management of large data sets. At one time we kind of went to a concept that 2 locations with all the same entries in both locations was good trial data. And then we went to other kinds of forms. But today, if you talk to the big companies, they're pulling the data from thousands of data points from the southern and the northern hemisphere, grouping them into ecoregions and pulling data, thousands of data points from thousands of locations, and able to analyze it. And that may just be the start of it. Drivers have changed. Education prior to 1920, there were very few plant breeders, and I don't want to get to too much introductory plant breeding, but you can say farmers were always plant breeders and did selection, but they were using mass selection and not our modern tools. Plant breeders and those working on fundamental genetics in support of plant breeding have increased many-fold. Today we have more people working in this area at Texas A&M than there were in the whole world 100 years ago. And this has occurred through a massive educational effort. One of the big drivers of change is intellectual property. Recent advances in intellectual property rights throughout the world have led to investments by major companies in plant breeding research. Top 3 companies investing as much as $5 million per day in plant breeding research. That's why there are jobs for you as plant breeding students, is because of this huge investment. Do not get it wrong. Companies are not investing to lose money. They're investing because they see it as a profit source, and they see the value that plant breeding can add by virtue of protecting the intellectual property behind it, can generate return for them. So sometimes we gloss over intellectual property. Sometimes we even despise it because of the paperwork. Sometimes we talk about the infringements, but it is the reason that this room can be this full today. Public investment in plant breeding. International centers such as CIMMYT, Erie, and ACARTA, and that's because that's all the ones I could spell. But there's all the international centers. Major universities around the world have made a big contribution. Individual country investments such as MBRAPA and the ARS, and since I was in Turkey, they shared with me that they make a pretty good investment too. Were the primary drivers of the historical change. What will be their role going forward? And so the future of plant breeding gains will be largely driven, in my mind, by these same fundamentals. Encouragement of investment in plant breeding through protection of intellectual property developed through it, development of new fundamental technology, and ongoing investment in education. The first one I want to talk about the future of is intellectual property, because I think it's something that you cannot ignore. Huge investments by private industry have been driven by the protection of intellectual property. There's some key ingredients to it. It must be fair and transparent over countries. If we're really going to benefit the world and feed the world through plant breeding, intellectual property has to go across countries. We have to have a way to protect patents. We have to have a way to protect plant varieties and cultivars. And we have to have a way to protect the underlying technology that we might use. And if those ingredients are missing, I think we can expect less productivity from plant breeding than if they're present. We cannot expect to meet the future food demands of a growing population without the protection of intellectual property and subsequent willingness to invest in the development of new ideas. If you talk about government investment, which might be an alternative, national investments are critical but declining in much of the world. China and Brazil are exceptions, where if you look at it as a percentage of GNP, they've actually been increasing their government investment in agriculture. There are a few other countries that probably fit in that category as well. It's especially important for education. International centers. If you look at some of the international centers, have any of you seen a CARTA lately? Do any of you know where a CARTA is?
Different countries.
Completely run over by the Syrian rebels and demolished and robbed and destroyed. Infrastructure is crumbling, needs a new infusion of capital. One of the places that just got a brand new infusion of capital was Cimet, to take on more molecular work at Cimet, and in both their corn and their wheat program. But the future of plant breeding is going to be largely determined by investment, and that's one of the concerns that I have, is where these centers are going to get funding to move forward. New investments critical to our future. We cannot expect to meet the needs of 9 to 10 billion people without investing in that. And this gets more specific to the meeting, but looking at the papers for this meeting, it highlights much new technology for plant breeding. From high throughput sequencing to automated phenotyping to marker assisted selection to doubled haploids for crops that we haven't had doubled haploid capacity in. We talked a little bit about a new technology. How many of you followed Seth's new paper on nature biotechnology? You know, when we talk about the future, and I just give this an example because anytime you have new technology, there's a chance that 10 years from now nobody will know what it is because it didn't work out and it doesn't pay off. There were probably some other kind of light bulbs invented that didn't ever get to market. But this is a proposed in vitro approach to generating mature, fully functional female gametes from embryonic and induced pluripotent stem cells as a means for rapidly breeding and introducing new traits into livestock and crops. And with Seth sitting here, I don't want to try to tell you what the paper says, but what it says is that we can increase generation times if we can make the cross using induced gametes rather than growing a mature plant. A mature pine tree, for example, might take 20 years to get the first pine cone. A mature fruit tree, what do you figure, 7 years?
3. For peaches, 3.
3.
Still a long time.
It's a long time. So I think that those kinds of technologies, and this is an example of one of them, are the future of plant breeding. And if we don't invest in those, our future is less bright than if we do. And GMOs, there's always lots of different opinions on GMOs, but while not particularly new to corn, cotton, and soybean, we grow a lot of hectares of them. And I wanted to be cautious, so I only said 100 million hectares, but it's probably more than that. Utilization beyond herbicide and BT has really been limited. Utilization in wheat, rice, sorghum, and cassava has been very limited. And most other crops haven't benefited at all. So as you look at our core food crops, a really limited impact of GMOs to this stage. And we have so much potential there, from improvements in food quality like glycine and other limiting amino acids, fatty acid composition, fruit quality, other nutrients, iron, selenium, drought resistance and pest resistance that could be added through the GMO portfolio. But without an improved set of world guidelines and a world agreement on this, the world may not get to where they can effectively use many more GMOs. Will we get guidelines on safety that rely on past experience for meeting safety standards? Currently, if you release a genetically modified organism, if you find a trait for cotton and you do all the background data on it and everything else and show that there are no allergens produced or no anything else, if you put that same trait in another crop, you have to repeat all the data. And that's if you're in the US. If you're in Europe, there becomes a political process one notch beyond that. And so it's really difficult to move things through that channel. I think we have to look at some common sense approaches to provide safety. The world demands food safety, and we have to have safe food. So we have to be able to assure that, but we have to be able to assure it without limiting the ability to utilize it to one or two multi-billion-dollar national companies. I'm not going to go through this because this is where I went through what you all do, and I'll just insult somebody by what I left out. But this is this is where we talk about the future of plant breeding, and I go through several of the programs from Texas. I go through several of the educational programs that we have. I go through the Beetle Borlaug program, and I went through the PhD distance program and the opportunities we have to implement that here at Texas A&M. That predominated the rest of the conference was the feedback on the future educational programs and how we're going to deal with those. So it was really exciting. I hope that we have a lot of future students that are based on that. I think it will be, well, I think it's a huge opportunity for Texas A&M to make a world impact and to be the leaders. But part of what I wanted to do today, since this is your last session, let's turn up the lights. We're done with this. I just wanted to find out what all you think the future of plant breeding is. I mean, you're majoring in it and getting PhDs and master's degrees in it. You probably thought there was some future there. What do you think are going to be the drivers of plant breeding in the country that you work in? You're the host. I'll start with you.
Does somebody else have an idea?
What did I leave off?
A high-paid position.
What's going to generate that high-paid position? Yes.
I see a comparison to your grandmother in the comic books, and that's the future. Well, if you compare it to the movie Gattaca, with they're able to choose their gender, eye color, everything like that, I mean, we should be able to choose that in plants, and that would be desirable someone who has the technology to choose absolutely everything.
What's the driver of the future of plant breeding? I mean, when you develop a new variety that produces twice as much, what are you doing?
Water is going to become limiting. Water already is limiting. I know on the East Coast, in places like New York.
So tell me what water is. You know, I was in the Mediterranean. I could see water as far as I could see.
Fresh water.
Oh, fresh
water
water.
is limited.
Okay. Fresh water is limiting.
And it's a shame we don't have Icarta anymore. You know,
Oh,
because
we still have the scientists. They're
Oh,
floating
we do
around
have
in
it.
various
But
countries
it's in
around.
different countries.
okay.
They shipped them off to various other centers, and,
Yeah.
but we did lose a lot of infrastructure, and it will be tough to regain.
I know that the future is going to be tough because we have changing climates, and that's going to increase the virulence of diseases, the virulence of weeds. Heat stress is going to be a limiting factor. In wheat, for example, we're supposed to have 30% increase in yield over the next maybe 20 years or so in the face of this changing climate. So it's a very difficult task ahead of us. And we talked about biotechnology. I mean, for the last 20 years, we have seen only two traits: glyphosate resistance and Bt gene, which is a gene from bacteria.
Well, that's
Well,
not quite true. We got glufosinate, we got,
Yeah, but these are the major
Everything
ones
I-
used today, right?
there's a pretty fair chunk of glufosinate out there.
Okay.
I mean, I will give you herbicide resistance and various forms of Bt, but even the various forms of Bt are completely different traits.
Yeah. So
There's a half dozen different BTs.
So we need to be thinking out of the box, to be able to make that big jump in yield in the face of changing climate.
Yeah, how do you get from qualitative to quantitative?
But let's back up. We have the technology as breeders to produce a certain number of calories. What really drives the need? Do you project population to continue to go up?
It is going to go up, yeah.
Well, not if we don't produce more food.
For the United States, we produce plenty of food.
Yes, we do.
It's for other countries.
Distribution.
You hinted to the fact that it's very difficult to protect an investment in a third world or developing nation. So a lot of new varieties, a lot of more nutritious varieties are hard. It's hard to get those things to grow there because you can't protect your investment.
Do you think that's the reason?
One.
No, I'm just asking.
One of them.
Because I would say that most of the fortified varieties that I've read about, the intellectual property, have been willing to give them away and to provide them for free. And so they still haven't necessarily gone. So I don't know that the constraint. I'll give you an example. We have low gossipal cotton. Takes money to get it developed, etc. But we would use it for to increase the availability of food in Africa if people wanted it, because it's a GMO. There's still mixed feelings about whether they'd rather starve or have it. And the people making the decisions are not the ones starving, but it's still, that goes into the decision process. If you didn't know, I struggle a little with sometimes how much more food we need and where we need it and what we're going to be breeding for and how we're going to utilize our tools and our techniques. We have set up a structure right now where it costs about, what is it, Steve? 100 million to get a trade approved?
Yeah, more than that.
No, it's a
One,
reasonable figure.
yeah, 140 million, yeah.
So, if you're talking about a crop with 2 million acres, the math is tough to work on. It starts to be quite a few dollars per acre, and so I don't know how we're going to make those decisions in the future. There are a lot of ethical decisions in plant breeding, and we sit back and go, ours is to cycle and make the cross and get the highest yielding, most protein, best fiber, best oil, sweetest tasting peach, and go with it. But I'd challenge each of you to think about the ethical considerations of plant breeding that are involved as to why you're breeding, not just because you got a grant, but what you're going to accomplish and what you're going to do for the world, who you're serving through that breeding program. Who are you going to serve? What are you breeding? What's your crop?
Wait.
So what are you going to do if you improve yield of wheat?
To improve their tolerance to stress environment.
To stress environments. Mhm. Do we have a shortage of wheat now? Do we have a shortage of wheat right now? So, who's going to benefit from this? Who's the beneficiary of improved wheat varieties with stress tolerance?
The people in the future, because of climate change. Climate is changing, and it get warmer and warmer.
So grow corn.
Corn.
You cannot make cakes out of corn.
So I don't know if this came up, but I think one of the things that often doesn't come up enough, and I think it was Jack Harlan who originally sort of pointed this out, is we've domesticated thousands of crops, and we're increasingly focusing on fewer and fewer of them. And this is coming from the corn breeder, not the cowpea breeder. I want to point that out. And I think that the future of plant breeding, in some ways, is really going to be the realization that we may not make the gains that keep on being promised in wheat or in corn or anything like that, and maybe we need to diversify our food. But I'm not sure if the private sector is prepared for that. I'm not sure if the public sector is prepared for that. And we just sort of heard that right now. Grow corn. Well, there may be an upper limit to how much corn is going to yield, or wheat. So.
Well, I know that once upon a time someone posed to me was that if you have GMO and you can modify corn extensively and alter the amino acid content and alter the sweetness and alter the protein and alter the fatty acid composition, why grow any other crop? Just modify corn to produce the...
Increase the
Can I add something to that? If you look at Europe and the rest of the world in terms of wheat breeding, you'll see that in Europe wheat breeding is going at the same pace as corn, because they don't have to focus on quality, and they have on average about 6 fungicide applications, right? So if we don't have to focus on the end use quality and disease in wheat, we can make tremendous gains. Now, if we can find a unique or a novel approach to glutenins and gliadins and make those in the lab and just blend them into wheat, I mean, the sky's the limit in terms of how we can maximize yield potential. So we should not only think, that's what I meant by thinking out of the box, you know.
Well, that's why I was talking about putting the bread baking qualities into corn.
Yep.
You already have,
But you
you
got-
already have the yield
Well,
in corn, let's
might
put the
be-
right protein.
No, it might be easier to increase the yield of wheat and just blend the gluten and some gliadins into wheat.
It might be.
Let's put in the cottonseed and we'll have both clothes and food.
They eat them for food, not only for food.
But they
like-
can eat other things. Right? What's wheat provide? That's what I'm asking you. What does wheat provide that other crops don't?
Every kind of food has their own tasting, and people like that.
Uh-huh.
So this is the need, which drives wheat breeding. And for now, wheat is the main food in the world.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, corn also is also the main food. But people like to eat wheat and some others.
And all I was getting is what comes from wheat. And the ability to rise and to bake with it is
To make the loaf of bread rise.
is the primary thing that we attribute to wheat. The protein comes from his cowpeas or peanuts or what? Yes.
Can I make some?
Yeah.
This is the best forum, so maybe I want to put my thinking a little bit on this. Breeding for yield per se is one thing, and breeding for quality, improving the quality of it. So yield per se, as it is becoming very evident that the population growth probably will stabilize not more than 10 billion, 9 to 10 billion. Looks like it will happen, even though China now has introduced two-child policy, but I don't think it will make much difference. So if we are talking about 10 billion people, today we are at 7.2 billion. In my presentation, I mentioned that we need only to increase 0.7% growth per year in next 30, 40 years to meet the demand at a current level of consumption. Now, already it has been demonstrated in maize your average yield in US is 10 tons per hectare, but the world average is less than 4 tons. Same thing is wheat. The wheat highest yield has been demonstrated more than 10 ton. Actually, Europe gets more than 10 ton, become winter wheat. Spring wheat is a little bit less. So the yield potential of wheat is 10 ton, 12 ton. In hybrid rice, in Chinese have demonstrated 13 tons per hectare. So when we come to yield per hectare, maize, major cereals, which are the staple, we have reached that level. The controversy is for every ton of yield we remove from the soil, we are removing 50 kilo of nutrients. So if you have 10 tons yield, we are removing 500 kilogram of nutrients. Environmentalists are saying you are putting too much fertilizer. So if we increase yield to 10 ton, 20 tons, then the nutrients needed, fertilizer, pesticide, other things needed will be too much. So do we need to go for high yield? Now that is where my point is. What I'm saying is if we can bridge the yield gap of Africa, which is 1 ton per hectare, if they can go to 3 tons, India is 2.5 tons, which can go to 4 tons, China is already 5 tons and 6 tons, we will meet that food needs. So the biotechnology which is coming up with the second, third generation of improvement, so far, as Amir is saying, in the last 30 years, only we have seen herbicide tolerance and insect resistance, which is there. And I think in biotechnology, even though all kinds of things are going on, genomic selection, this selection for yield and so on, I think we cannot make much progress other than major genes. So I think that if we can improve protein in cassava, amino acid contents in other crops to improve the quality and bridge the yield gap to 10 ton per hectare of everything, all the cereals, pulses can be 3 ton, 4 ton, which is possible. So the next generation plant breeders devote time on quality, both the conventional as well as biotechnology, which is possible. Not worry too much about improving the yield. Genome-wide selection for yield, it's a dream. I think it's a pie in the sky, will never come. But we can improve the protein in cassava. We can improve the sulfur-containing amino acids in pulses. Already Brazilians are doing it. So this is where we have a tremendous opportunity to improve the food quality.
But we live in a free market economy. You cannot tell the producers in this country not to produce more yield because we need to let the African
But
farmers grow
with the
more.
globalization, now with the
So-
globalization, with the technology, I mean, you know, when the cell phone was developed, we never knew that 950 million Indians have cell phone. It is the globalization will take care of it. So what I'm saying is, next generation plant breeding should be breeding for quality, at the same time stress tolerance. The climate change is real, and if we can have drought tolerant, heat tolerant, disease resistance, and so on that come. So we put our real stress on stress breeding, quality breeding, maintaining the yield at that high level which you have already achieved. I mean, that's my take in field. So biotechnology for major genes which affect quality, including protein, amino acid, fatty acid, all those quality traits, and maintaining the high level of yield. Wherever we have not reached, let us do that. But biotechnology for improving yield will be something, will keep paper after paper, but not much will happen. But we can definitely use biotechnology for major genes, the highly heritable genes, the quality genes, which is a possibility. And my concern is if only allow Monsanto to become the dictators or a kind of proprietors in the world, we can't do it. So the public sector should come into the major genes for quality, and that is where we have a future. That's my take. Sorry to take your time.
Well, yes, Ed.
Well, I sit here not as a plant breeder, obviously. It looks to me like climate change, water availability, and the heat stress that's coming into the picture, which seems to be accepted pretty much everywhere at the present time. And we have a couple of photosynthetic pathways, but do plants in general, depending on the photosynthetic pathways, produce the same amount of dry matter per unit of water that's transpired through the plant? Or is there a difference? Can you work on this photosynthesis or water use efficiency within the breeding community? I really don't know, but I think we have to get our water use efficiency up. And that doesn't mean transferring the Corn Belt 50 miles, 100 miles, 200 miles north because it's warmer, because I think we see climate variation also entering into this thing. So I worry, if I worry at all about this, I worry about how you get more photosynthetic product per unit of water.
Can I add something quickly here? The C4 crops are more efficient.
Yeah, I understand.
Corn and sorghum, okay? And
Pros don't
I
know
see
it.
that Seth is smiling at that. And
Pros
so,
don't know it.
and so we either have to make crops like wheat and rice C4 crops, or maybe now we're starting to buy your point, or maybe just develop the quality in.
Well, I'm not worried
of
about
corn.
transferring C3 to C4. I'm worried about improving the C4s and the C3s as well. And I'm wondering, can it produce more dry matter, more harvestable dry matter per unit of water within those two photosynthetic pathways?
Sure.
I really don't know.
I have a question for you, Amir, because you've kind of driven the global climate change discussion here today.
Okay.
We were warmer once upon a time as an Earth,
When was that? When was it? Long time ago.
back when the oil was formed. We have petroleum products that we mine today.
That's right, but we didn't have 7 billion people then.
But was biomass production higher or lower then?
We have to look at the.
I don't think there's anything that would indicate that biomass production wasn't higher when the climate was warmer. Wheat production might not have been, but I don't think you can look and say biomass production wasn't higher. Those oil reserves didn't come from a no biomass environment. And I'm willing to give you geological time and all of that, but warm doesn't mean decreased productivity per se. Warm, now, climate variation. If you have hotter than hazy summer and cold winters that freeze too early and too late, climate variation can goof you up. But if you're just talking about a warmer by 2 degrees or 3 degrees and higher CO2, I don't think you're talking about a net vegetation decrease. And our job is to convert vegetation to human food, and that may mean different crops. It may mean more cassava. It may mean more sorghum. But I think those opportunities are there.
You know, I don't want to contradict you on the logic, but there's been a couple of articles in Science, Nature, places like that recently where the physiologists have modeled climate change, and they actually show there will be a net decrease because it's above the temperature that the crops, when they flower, generally, it's above the temperature that they're happiest at, that you get increased photorespiration.
But that's a given set of
The major crops.
But that's what I said. We may have to go to cassava. We may have to go to sorghum.
Exactly.
But our job is to convert the biomass, but I don't think you can show biomass is lower. And that's just, what do you call that? Conversion and translocation. We're the physiologist. But if you produce the biomass, you can transform it to more complex carbohydrates and starches and sugars and even fibers.
But say, about the prediction is in next century, in 100 years from now, the temperature may go to 1 degree Celsius. Based on that,
Every decade.
no, not every decade. It's the next century, 100 years will be go about 1 degree, 1 to 3 degree, 1 to 3. So let's say it is even 2 degrees Celsius. The same predictions say that in temperate region, yield will increase. In the tropics, also yield will increase because of higher carbon dioxide.
Well, if you grow all the
What
crops here.
what will happen is the ocean level will rise, so people living on the coastal area
And it will be
may have a
flooded.
little problem, but the yield may not go down. All those predictions are assuming 5-6 degrees Celsius increase. There are certain things that we as a scientists should take it with a pinch of salt. Not like, when Malthus predicted that we will be all wiped out of the face of earth, he did had a point to raise the alarm, but we should not be carried away with that. So in long run, we don't know what will happen, but at least up to 1 more century, it is not going to be that bad. So we should breed for stress tolerance. Yes, drought tolerance, heat tolerance, wherever we can. That should be our focus. But I am not going to be alarmed so much about what will happen when it is 5 degrees, 6 degrees Celsius. And that Baltensperger is saying, in the past, there have been extremes of weather kind of a thing, which happens, not just so much because of our problem, but just the way the cycle is there, nature is there. So what we should do is what is realistic right now.
Yeah.
Wayne, you were...
Excellent discussion, but before we get away, could you share if you picked up what breeders were doing in other countries that you thought was interesting?
Yeah. One of the things that I left with, and I've had the appreciation for many years, but Europe beat us by about 10 years to develop intellectual property protection for plants. And somebody that's really good at numbers can tell me whether it's 15 years or 7 years. But they beat us by a breeding cycle on coming up with some protection mechanism for plants. If you look at that, that's led to tremendous investment in Europe versus, and that investment's now being translocated through the expansion of the EC to Turkey and around the corner to the Eastern European countries that were under the bloc. So the Lithuania and Albania and all of those countries of, what do we call it, Western Asia, Eastern Europe, are all moving to that same protection model. And many of the discussions were on aligning their protection model over a bigger region for the Sudan and Pakistan and others to go into that same model. And the things that it drives, it drives ingenuity, and then everybody is working on everything because they think that if they can improve protein, they can sell the protein. If they can improve fatty acid composition, they can sell the fatty acid composition. So the entrepreneurial spirit comes to life. And the things that get worked on the most are what I would call the biggest needs. But their investment, their big investment, and, you know, I've bred a lot of different crops in my career. I think for those of you who wonder what my background is as a department head, I was a plant breeder once upon a time. I think that I have 37 different genera that I've released varieties in or co-released varieties in. So I wasn't ever a corn breeder or a cotton breeder. I was a crop breeder working on a lot of different crops. But I was working on them for a specific area of adaptation. And so looking at segregating material for best adaptation to that region. That's the same thing we're looking at with climate change, is these regions are going to change. So specific adaptation to a region may alter. And that's where the investment over there is in adaptation to a region. And what makes plant breeding move? We talked about GMOs today. We talked about markers. We talked about some other things. But you can't develop markers and you can't develop GMOs if you don't have a screening technique that can differentiate one genotype from another to start with. And our capacity to generate screening techniques was really the highlight of that meeting. I mean, they are working on screening techniques on 20 different traits on every different crop. And so that, Amir, what are you working on for screening techniques? What are new screening techniques that you've applied?
Well, we're increasing our capacity in high throughput genotyping and phenotyping now.
But what's the screening technique you're looking at?
Phenotyping.
Phenotyping.
But what are you phenotyping for? What's the
Oh,
character?
stresses, basically stresses, crop stresses.
Well, I would say the big one that you've made improvement on, though, as a team so far has been tortilla. You know, we didn't used to breed for tortilla wheat. We bred for bread wheat. Through his program and the quality program of Dr. Awika and others, we're now breeding for capacity to make a better tortilla. And that's coming to fruition. It's the trait. You can develop a marker to find it, you can develop a sequence to find it, but if you don't define what makes a better tortilla, you can't do any of those things. If you don't define what makes a better peach, and you can't separate it, you can't develop a marker for it. And so a huge portion is having the vision to define where the difference is. What's the new bug you got? Sugar cane sorghum killer? The sugar cane, an aphid.
They think it's sugar cane. We'll blame it on the sugar cane people.
But having the capacity to differentiate a resistant plant from a susceptible plant becomes fairly significant. Right now, what he's identified is everything susceptible. And so the screening technique that will differentiate and give you incremental differentiation is huge. When you start to talk about multiple genes that control a trait, lots of times parts of those genes exist, but they haven't been packaged to bring the full expression out. Amir deals with that all the time with wheat rust, that he doesn't have all the genes for, what's the new one,
UG99. Actually, we're putting about 5 genes now using markers.
But you figured out how to differentiate it first.
Yeah, sure.
And that is the step I think we don't place enough emphasis on here. We are right up there on the technology. We jump to develop a marker as soon as we find a way to screen it, but we are not investing as heavily in developing.
And
And
by
do you
the
know
way,
why? Because our plant pathologists and entomologists have all turned into molecular people, and we're getting no fundamental support at differentiation. How's that? Some of us have to work in the differentiation arena. Then you can develop markers. Okay, that was my soap opera.
We developed actually, sorry, we developed the markers for UG99 because we cannot bring it into this country.
But they already knew how to differentiate it.
That's right.
Your
So we
own-
developed the markers using data that was conducted in Kenya and Ethiopia. And now we have a proactive approach to put those markers in our lines before the frost is here. So I think that's a very valid explanation for why we use markers. It's not because of the luxury of markers.
But you're jumping the gun.
We don't have another choice to do it.
If they didn't know how to differentiate it in Africa, you couldn't make a marker.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And the ability to differentiate is where I want to leave. That if you're going to be a plant breeder, you've got to differentiate your traits. And one of the big problems why we haven't made improvement in fiber quality, we measure micronair. How many of you work on micronair? Where are your cotton breeders at?
We should look at it. We don't work, you don't work on micronair, you just work to keep it in a range. You don't maximize it or minimize it, so you can't do much with it.
They don't even know how to measure it.
Oh yeah, we got a micronair machine. We don't know what it means, but we got a machine. Anyway, I appreciate those last remarks, and I think every student in here who wants to be a field-based plant breeder should appreciate those also, because, and I don't mean to be derogatory toward the molecular genetics side of plant breeding. It's extremely valuable, and we've done a whole lot. We're going to do a whole lot more, and you guys in here are going to do a whole lot more. But it's nice to see field-based people in phenotyping receive a little bit of attention and appreciation. And so it's great to hear it's going on in this country, so it's great to hear that it's going on worldwide.
I've eaten up your time. I really appreciate that you are the future. You know, a bunch of old people did most of the talking today. But think about what you're going to do to make the future, because truly, you are the future. I've released my last variety, and that might not be true. I have one coming out next week.
Make one comment. I'm afraid that in the future we'll not see a room full of people like this, because I think with declining funding, with declining public funding, we're going to see an increase in private sector investment in ag. And I think their model in the future is going to be like that. They're going to hire at the MS level and try to ask their students to pursue online degrees. And so
That means you and I just have to work harder to attract students.
The room's going to be a little bit more. We've lost them at Dallas. They got bored with it. But the room's going to be a little bit more like that, where they're going to be from around the world. And no, there's no bigger hindrance. And I've visited a lot of countries in the past, but this is the first time I spent a solid week with people who couldn't talk to each other, because one of them knew Polish, and one of them knew German, and one of them knew Italian, and one of them knew Arabic, and the closest they could get was English, and it just was like pulling teeth to have a good conversation. I hope you all learn 7 languages before you leave, because it's so important to be able to share across the world. And if we can't share across the world, we will not have the future that is as bright as possible. Thank you.